The morning of September 15th, 1942, began like nearly every other morning in the waters south of Guadalcanal. The sky was pale and clear, the sea uncommonly calm. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, sailors moved through their routines with a particular efficiency of men who had grown accustomed to danger without quite growing numb to it. Planes were spotted on the flight deck. Fuel lines were checked. Coffee was poured in steel mugs and carried up ladders to the bridge. At 2:02 in the afternoon, the carrier swung into the wind to receive her aircraft. She was steaming at 18 knots. Her escort spread across the water around her in the familiar geometry of a task force. Destroyers carved white lines through the blue. The heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City moved ahead. Somewhere off the Wasp's starboard quarter, another carrier, the Hornet, steamed in company. Beyond her, the new battleship USS North Carolina. It was, by all appearances, a routine afternoon in what had become a grinding, brutal campaign for an island most of the men aboard had never heard of 6 months earlier. Then a lookout on the destroyer USS Lansdowne spotted something that no lookout ever wanted to see in those waters. White streaks beneath the surface, moving fast, moving in a way that made the stomach drop before the mind had fully processed what the eyes were reporting. In the next 90 seconds, the USS Wasp was struck by 3 torpedoes. Fires broke out simultaneously in the forward gasoline stowage, the forward ammunition magazine, and amid the parked aircraft on the hangar deck. The explosions were so violent that men were thrown from their feet on ships over a mile away. Within minutes, secondary detonations were tearing the carrier apart from the inside. She would be abandoned before 4 o'clock. She would sink before 9, but the attack was not finished. 2 of the same salvo of torpedoes fired from a single submarine, in a single spread at a single moment, had continued running past the burning Wasp, past the destroyer scrambling to find the attacker, across miles of open ocean. One of them struck the North Carolina, the most modern battleship in the United States Navy, tearing a hole in her hull 32 feet wide. Another struck the destroyer O'Brien, which would break apart and sink a month later while attempting to reach port for repairs. 1 submarine, 1 salvo, 3 warships hit simultaneously, a carrier, a battleship, and a destroyer, in a single afternoon. The submarine was the I-19, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Takaichi Kinashi. And the weapon that had just rewritten the laws of naval warfare was something that American naval intelligence had been formally, confidently, and repeatedly told could not exist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the long-lance torpedo shocked the world the way it did, and why it had been so thoroughly dismissed before that shock arrived, you need to go back roughly 15 years, back to a converted conference room in the Japanese Naval Technical Department in the early 1930s, and to an engineer named Kishimoto Kaneji, who was about to propose something that his own colleagues initially considered absurd. The torpedo, by the 1920s, was a mature weapon. Every major naval power had them. Every major naval power understood their limitations. A torpedo required compressed air to drive its engine, and that compressed air produced one unavoidable and potentially fatal problem: bubbles. A torpedo running on compressed air left a visible wake, a white frothy line on the surface of the water, pointing directly back toward the ship that fired it. Every destroyer captain in every navy knew to look for the wake, trace it backward, and put the ship at the end of that line at the bottom of the ocean. Beyond the wake problem, there was the range problem. Compressed air torpedoes of the era had effective ranges measured in the low thousands of yards. The best Japanese Navy torpedo before Kishimoto's work, the Type 8, could manage roughly 7,000 yards at 42 knots. American and British torpedoes were comparable. The consensus among naval planners was that this was simply the nature of the technology. Physics imposed its limits. You could speed or range, but not both, and whatever you chose, you would leave a wake. Kishimoto's proposal was to power the torpedo with pure oxygen instead of compressed air. The reaction from his colleagues was not enthusiasm. Pure oxygen in a weapon designed to be launched from a ship to travel through water at high speed and potentially to collide with things, including its own launch tube if something went wrong, was considered not merely ambitious but reckless. The history of oxygen fuel technology at that time was, to be polite, checkered. Pure oxygen at pressure combined with heat or shock had a tendency to do things that engineers would rather it did not. Several experiments had already killed people. The Navy's own torpedo research had seen catastrophic failures. The objections were not unreasonable. They were the objections of cautious men with genuine experience of what happened when things went wrong. Kishimoto argued back. He had spent years studying the chemistry and engineering of the problem. He understood the risks but believed they were manageable. More importantly, he understood what a successful oxygen-powered torpedo would mean. Without the nitrogen and compressed air, there would be no wake. The exhaust gases, primarily water vapor and carbon dioxide, would dissolve almost completely into surrounding water, leaving the torpedo essentially invisible in its passage. And without the dead weight fraction of nitrogen making up 78% of the air charge, the oxygen fuel was far more energetically dense. The torpedo could carry dramatically more power in the same volume. Range and speed could both be increased beyond anything the compressed air designs could achieve. He was, in essence, arguing that the fundamental limitation everyone had accepted as permanent was actually an engineering problem with an engineering solution. The Imperial Japanese Navy gave him permission to continue. Development was slow, difficult, and dangerous. There were explosions during testing. There were phases of the program when it seemed the skeptics had been right all along, and the entire concept was simply too unstable to militarize. But Kishimoto persisted. His team adapted their designs, and by the early 1930s, the weapon was beginning to take shape. What emerged, formally designated the Type 93 torpedo, but known among the sailors who fired it as the Sanso Jirai, the oxygen torpedo, was unlike anything else in the world's navies. Its statistics, when they later became known to American intelligence analysts, were initially regarded with open disbelief. The Type 93 ran at 48 knots to a range of approximately 22,000 yards. At a reduced speed of 36 knots, its range extended to 40,000 yards, more than 20 miles. Its warhead carried over 1,000 pounds of explosive. It left in calm to moderate sea conditions, essentially no visible wake. For comparison, the standard American Mark 15 torpedo of the same period had a range of roughly 6,000 yards at 45 knots. The long lance could kill from 3 times that distance, and you might not see it coming. The weapon was a complete departure from the accepted parameters of torpedo design. It was not an incremental improvement. It was a different category of thing, built on a theoretical foundation that Western navies had largely dismissed as impractical, and that, more than anything, explains why it remained a secret for as long as it did. The secrecy around the Type 93 was extraordinary even by the standards of service that took military security seriously. Japan had withdrawn from the Washington Naval Treaty System by the mid-1930s, but the specific capabilities of her weapons remained closely guarded. The torpedo was deployed aboard destroyers and cruisers, but the men who fired it knew better than to discuss it with anyone outside their immediate circle. Foreign observers who caught glimpses of Japanese destroyer exercises at sea occasionally noted that they seemed to leave unusually clean wakes, but the explanation was attributed to skillful ship handling or favorable sea conditions. No one connected the dots. The morning of September 15th, 1942, began like nearly every other morning in the waters south of Guadalcanal. The sky was pale and clear, the sea uncommonly calm. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, sailors moved through their routines with a particular efficiency of men who had grown accustomed to danger without quite growing numb to it. Planes were spotted on the flight deck. Fuel lines were checked. Coffee was poured in steel mugs and carried up ladders to the bridge. At 2:02 in the afternoon, the carrier swung into the wind to receive her aircraft. She was steaming at 18 knots. Her escort spread across the water around her in the familiar geometry of a task force. Destroyers carved white lines through the blue. The heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City moved ahead. Somewhere off the Wasp's starboard quarter, another carrier, the Hornet, steamed in company. Beyond her, the new battleship USS North Carolina. It was, by all appearances, A routine afternoon in what had become a grinding, brutal campaign for an island most of the men aboard had never heard of 6 months earlier. Then a lookout on the destroyer USS Lansdowne spotted something that no lookout ever wanted to see in those waters. White streaks beneath the surface, moving fast, moving in a way that made the stomach drop before the mind had fully processed what the eyes were reporting. In the next 90 seconds, the USS Wasp was struck by 3 torpedoes. Fires broke out simultaneously in the forward gasoline stowage, the forward ammunition magazine, and amid the parked aircraft on the hangar deck. The explosions were so violent that men were thrown from their feet on ships over a mile away. Within minutes, secondary detonations were tearing the carrier apart from the inside. She would be abandoned before 4 o'clock. She would sink before 9, but the attack was not finished. 2 of the same salvo torpedoes fired from a single submarine, in a single spread at a single moment, had continued running past a burning Wasp, past the destroyer scrambling to find the attacker, across miles of open ocean. One of them struck the North Carolina, the most modern battleship in the United States Navy, tearing a hole in her hull 32 feet wide. Another struck the destroyer O'Brien, which would break apart and sink a month later while attempting to reach port for repairs. 1 submarine, 1 salvo, 3 warships hit simultaneously, a carrier, a battleship, and a destroyer, in a single afternoon. The submarine was the I-19, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Takaichi Kinashi, and the weapon that had just rewritten the laws of naval warfare was something that American naval intelligence had been formally, confidently, and repeatedly told could not exist. American naval intelligence, when it assessed Japanese torpedo capabilities in years before Pearl Harbor, largely relied on extrapolation from what was known about standard compressed air technology. The conclusions reached were broadly correct for that technology and entirely wrong for what Japan had actually built. A formal assessment from this period essentially concluded that Japanese torpedo capabilities were comparable to American ones, perhaps slightly inferior in reliability. There is a particular quality to the kind of mistake that comes not from lack of information, but from a framework that cannot accommodate the information available. The American analysts were not stupid men. They were reasoning carefully within a set of assumptions about what was technically possible, assumptions that Kishimoto's team had already quietly disproved in a test range off the Kyushu coast years earlier. This is worth pausing on, because it is the central irony of the entire Longland story. The weapon that would shock the United States Navy in 1942 was not a sudden breakthrough. It had been deployed, tested, refined, and integrated into Japanese naval doctrine for the better part of a decade before the first American ships felt its effects. The laughing, the dismissal of the impossible claims, the comfortable confidence in the understood limits of the technology happened entirely after the fact, in retrospect, as stunned American officers tried to explain to themselves what had hit their ships and why it had come from so far away that no lookout had seen any sign of an attack until it was too late. The weapon was not a toy. It never had been. The men who had dismissed it simply had not yet met it. To understand what Japan intended to do with the Longlands, you need to understand the strategic situation she faced in any potential conflict with the United States. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had established capital ship ratios between the great powers, and Japan had been assigned a ratio inferior to both the United States and Great Britain. In formal treaty terms, Japan was permitted a fleet 3/5 the size of America's in capital ships. For a navy that was being asked to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific against a potential enemy that could build ships at rates Japan could not match, this presented a fundamental problem. The Japanese answer was conceptually elegant. If you cannot match your enemy ship for ship, you must find ways to reduce his numerical superiority before the decisive fleet engagement. You must attrite his forces with weapons that exploit your specific advantages, geography, surprise, training, and technology, before the great gun battle that traditional naval doctrine said would ultimately decide the issue. This concept, known broadly in Japanese naval planning as the interceptive operations strategy, relied heavily on the submarine and destroyer forces. Long before a fleet action could occur, Japanese submarines and destroyer squadrons, equipped with a long lance, would strike at American forces as they crossed the Pacific, whittling down the numerical advantage until the moment came when the Japanese battle line could fight on even or favorable terms. The Long Lance was the cornerstone of this attritional strategy. A destroyer squadron firing a spread of Type 93 torpedoes could strike enemy ships at ranges where no return fire was possible. A spread of these weapons launched from multiple angles could theoretically saturate a formation's defensive maneuvering capacity. The long range meant that the firing ships could remain outside the effective gun range of their targets. The lack of visible wake denied the target any warning until it was too late to evade. Japanese destroyer crews trained for night torpedo attacks with an intensity that their American counterparts would not fully match until the hard lessons of Guadalcanal had been paid in blood. They trained in all weathers at all hours, working with their charts and their torpedo firing solutions until the calculations became as natural as breathing. Night operations were not feared, they were sought, because the darkness eroded the advantages that American technology and air power provided. The combination of superior weapon, superbly trained crews, and a tactical doctrine built around exploiting both was something that the United States Navy entered the Pacific War entirely unprepared to face. The price of that unpreparedness would be paid beginning on the night of August 8th and 9th, 1942, in the waters north of Guadalcanal, in a place the sailors would come to call Iron Bottom Sound. The First Battle of Savo Island is one of the worst defeats in United States naval history, and it is important to understand it not as a story of American cowardice or incompetence. Neither was present, but as a story of what happens when a Navy meets an enemy whose weapons and tactics it has fundamentally failed to anticipate. Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa brought his force south through the darkness on the night of August 8th. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, moving at 30 knots through waters his crews knew and had practiced in. The Allied force guarding the amphibious landings at Guadalcanal was divided between 2 patrol groups, northern and southern, with a gap between them that Mikawa intended to exploit. The Allied ships were not asleep. They were on alert. But they were on alert in the manner of men who understood night combat in a certain way, a way that did not fully account for what was about to happen. Mikawa's cruisers launched torpedoes at ranges that Allied doctrine did not consider operationally meaningful. The Long Lance weapons crossed distances that American and Australian officers had been taught to think of as outside engagement range. By the time the first impacts registered, the situation had moved far beyond any possibility of coordinated response. In roughly 32 minutes of action, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom of the Sound: the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, the USS Astoria, the HMAS Canberra. Over 1,000 American and Australian sailors died. Mikawa's force, having delivered one of the most tactically devastating night attacks in the history of surface warfare, withdrew without losing a single ship. The American after-action reports struggled to account for what had happened. Torpedoes had arrived from unexpected directions at unexpected ranges. Ships had been hit before their crews had any definitive indication that an attack was underway. The analysis was honest about the failures of coordination and communication that contributed to the disaster, but it was less complete about the technological dimension, about the weapon that had crossed impossible distances in the darkness and found its marks without leaving a trace. It would take months of painful experience, and the evidence collected from recovered torpedo fragments and the interrogation of Japanese prisoners before American naval intelligence began to assemble an accurate picture of what the Long Lance actually was. The formal recognition of its true capabilities, its range, its speed, its near-wakeless operation, came as a series of revisions to earlier assessments, each revision more uncomfortable than the last. The picture that emerged was of a weapon that had been operational for nearly a decade, that had been central to Japanese naval planning for nearly a decade, that American and British intelligence had fundamentally failed to characterize for nearly a decade. The men who had, in effect, laughed, who had found it implausible, who had attributed Japanese reports and rumors to exaggeration or misunderstanding, were confronted with the evidence at Savo Island, at Cape Esperance, at Tasvaranga, in every brutal surface engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. The laughter stopped. What replaced it was a determined and sometimes anguished effort to understand and to adapt. But adaptation takes time. And in the autumn of 1942, time was something the United States Navy was still in the painful process of buying. The submarine I-19 was not a destroyer. She was not part of the surface torpedo attack doctrine, that had produced Savo Island and would go on to produce the devastation of Tassafaronga in November. She was a fleet submarine of the Type B-1 class, roughly 356 feet long, displacing over 2,000 tons when submerged. She carried 17 Type 95 torpedoes, a submarine variant of the same oxygen fuel technology that had been built into the Type 93, modified for the different requirements of submarine launch, but carrying the same fundamental advantages of range and speed. Lieutenant Commander Kanashi had been at sea for weeks, operating in the waters around Guadalcanal, where the campaign had turned the Solomon Islands into a killing ground for ships of both navies. Japanese and American warships were dying in those waters at a rate that would have seemed fantastical in the peacetime calculations of the naval war planners. The ocean floor was accumulating wrecks. On September 15, 1942, the I-19 found herself in position with a target that her captain could not have dreamed of in his most optimistic projections. Not one carrier. 3 capital ships in view simultaneously. Kanashi fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. He fired them at the Wasp, the nearest and most clearly visible target. The range was approximately 1,000 yards, unusually close for a submarine attack, suggesting either exceptional positioning or an element of fortune in the approach. He fired and dove, and began the long, careful process of evading the inevitable counterattack. He had, at that range and with that spread angle, done everything he needed to do. What the Type 93's descendants did next was simply what they had been designed to do. 3 torpedoes found the Wasp. 2 continued running. The mathematics of the thing are still staggering to contemplate. The 2 torpedoes that overran the Wasp continued on courses that carried them across miles of open ocean before they found their secondary marks. The North Carolina took her hit approximately miles from the original target, close enough to the action to have already been maneuvering, already alerted, already doing everything a ship can do to avoid precisely this. She was struck anyway, by a weapon whose range made such conventional defensive maneuvering essentially irrelevant. The O'Brien, farther still, caught the last torpedo of the spread. She would make it a port, but the damage to her hull was progressive and structural, and she broke apart and sank in October while en route to San Francisco for proper repairs. 3 warships, 1 spread of 6 torpedoes, 1 submarine that was already diving before the first explosion reached the surface. No other submarine in the history of naval warfare has matched this record in a single attack. Kanashi and the I-19 survived the counterattack. The depth charging that followed was, by accounts, intense and prolonged, but the I-19 was a well-built boat with a capable crew. They returned to base. Kanashi was awarded the highest decoration available to a Japanese naval officer. The I-19's performance entered the record books of submarine warfare at a position it has never vacated. But the story of what happened on September 15th, 1942 is not really a story about Kanashi, however remarkable his achievement. It is a story about a weapon, and about the 15 years of engineering stubbornness, institutional skepticism, careful development, and professional excellence that produced it. Kishimoto Kaneji had proposed this oxygen torpedo in an era when naval planners on 3 continents were comfortable with their understanding of what was possible. He had been told, in various forms and by various people, that what he was proposing was impractical, that the risks were too great, that the achieved performance would not justify the engineering difficulties. He had been, in the vocabulary of the innovation skeptic, someone whose idea was too clever, too dangerous, and probably unnecessary. The weapon he built killed a fleet carrier, crippled a battleship, and sank a destroyer. In a single afternoon, from distances that the men who died, or nearly died, that day had been told were safe. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific texture of that dismissal. The dismissal of ideas not because the evidence against them is strong, but because the imagination cannot quite stretch to accommodate them. American naval intelligence had not failed to gather information about Japanese torpedo development. Reports had circulated. Observers had noticed things. The question was not entirely unasked, but it had been asked within a framework that treated the known limitations of compressed air torpedo technology as universal laws rather than as the specific limitations of a specific engineering approach. This is a common pattern in military history, and one of the most consistently expensive. The side that mistakes the current state of its own technology for the permanent boundary of what technology can do tends to find out its error in the worst possible way, not in a lecture hall or a planning meeting, but in the dark water south of Guadalcanal on an afternoon in September, when the white lines of something impossible came angling out of the blue and the alarms began to sound too late. The Long Lance was not a toy. It had never been a toy. It was the most technically advanced naval torpedo of the Second World War, built by an engineer who refused to accept that the things everyone knew were impossible were actually impossible, and deployed by a Navy that had bet its entire Pacific strategy on the weapon performing exactly as promised. It performed as promised. What came next? For the Japanese who had built it, for the Americans who had dismissed it, and for the campaign in those blood-soaked waters between Guadalcanal and the Slot, was the second chapter of the story. The chapter in which the side that had been shocked began, at terrible cost, to understand what it was dealing with, and the side that had built the miracle weapon began to learn that miracles, in war, are never quite enough. There is a particular quality to the learning that happens under fire. It is faster than peacetime learning, more thorough, and far more brutal in its methods. By the autumn of 1942, the United States Navy was enrolled in a curriculum it had not chosen, taught by instructors it would rather not have had, in a classroom that happened to be the dark water around a miserable island in the Solomon chain that had not appeared on most American maps 6 months earlier. Guadalcanal was doing things to the United States Navy that no peacetime exercise could have done. It was revealing, with a clarity that only genuine catastrophe provides, the precise shape and depth of what had not been understood. And what had not been understood, what kept appearing in the after-action reports like a recurring diagnosis that the doctors could not quite treat, was a Long Lance. The weapon had appeared at Savo Island in August. It had appeared in the engagement at Cape Esperance in October, where a Japanese reinforcement convoy had been surprised and punished, but had also managed to extract a toll from the American forces through torpedo attack. It had appeared in every surface engagement of what the Japanese called the Tokyo Express. The nightly destroyer runs down the slot between the islands that kept the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal supplied, and the American Navy perpetually reactive. American destroyer commanders were learning, painfully and one ship at a time, that the engagement distances they had been trained to consider safe were not safe, that a Japanese destroyer force sighted at 12,000 yards and beyond was not sighted at a comfortable distance, but at a potentially lethal one, that the standard doctrine of pressing in close with guns blazing, which had served well enough in the pre-Long Lance mental model surface combat, was a way to die in the Solomons. But the lesson that arrived with the full S force, the lesson that finally broke through the institutional resistance and made clear that the situation was not a matter of individual bad luck or tactical mistakes, but a systematic capability gap, came on the night of November 30th, 1942, in the waters off the northwest coast of Guadalcanal. It came at a place called Tasfaranga Point. Rear Admiral Carleton Wright had been in command of his task force for exactly 2 days when the battle found him. He had 5 heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Honolulu, and Northampton, and 6 destroyers, and intelligence had told him that a Japanese reinforcement run was coming down the slot that night. His force was powerful, his radar was working, and he had every reason for confidence. The Japanese force, under Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, consisted of 8 destroyers. They were not a combat force in conventional sense. They were loaded with supply drums intended to be dumped offshore for the Guadalcanal garrison to retrieve. Several of them had their torpedo reloads and their tubes reduced or repositioned to make room for the supply cargo. By raw numbers and firepower, Wright's force was substantially stronger. Contact was made shortly before midnight. American radar detected the Japanese force at about 23,000 yards, over 11 miles. Wright held his fire for several minutes while his destroyers asked repeatedly for permission to launch torpedoes into the detected formation. When permission finally came, it came late, and the American Mark 15 torpedoes, with their shorter range and their limitations, some units suffering from the persistent reliability problems that had plagued American torpedoes throughout the early war, largely missed. Wright then opened with his cruisers' guns. The gunfire was accurate and immediate. The Japanese destroyer Takanami was caught in the illumination of radar-directed fire and torn apart, sinking quickly. Tanaka's force scattered in the confusion. By any initial reading of the action, the Americans appeared to have the better of it. Then the Long Lance answered. Tanaka's destroyers, even in the chaos of the American gunnery opening, even with their commander's flagship the Naganami absorbing near misses that shook the ship and wounded several men, had one response so deeply drilled it was essentially reflexive. They launched their Type 93 torpedoes. They launched them in spreads designed to cover the likely positions of the American ships. They launched them from ranges that the American cruiser commanders had not yet fully adjusted their threat calculus to account for. And then they ran. The Minneapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes. Her bow was blown off forward of the number 1 turret. She survived, but she was out of fight and would spend 11 months in repair. The New Orleans was struck moments later. Her forward section exploded. The torpedo had detonated beneath the forward magazines, and approximately 150 feet of her bow, including the forward turrets, were simply gone. She too survived barely, her crew fighting flooding through the night. The Pensacola took a torpedo that started a fire in her after fuel tanks that burned for hours and killed over 100 men. The Northampton was struck by 2 torpedoes, rolled over, and sank before 3 in the morning. 4 heavy cruisers hit. 1 sunk. 3 so badly damaged they would be out of the war for the better part of a year. The Honolulu alone escaped undamaged because she was at the rear of the American column, and the torpedoes that might have reached her had either run to the end of their range or been aimed at the other ships. Tanaka's force, having absorbed severe damage to the Takanami and taken near misses on several other ships, disengaged and steamed back up the slot. The tally was almost incomprehensible. An American force that possessed every apparent advantage, superior numbers, superior firepower, working radar, advanced intelligence of the enemy's approach, had been fought to a standstill by destroyers loaded with supply drums, using weapons whose capabilities the Americans had still not fully recalibrated their doctrine to account for. The after-action analysis was, to the Navy's credit, honest. The reports did not try to explain away what had happened. They named the problem, the torpedo. They named its characteristics, the range, the speed, the invisibility. They named the doctrinal gap. American forces were still, in some respects, fighting the previous war's assumptions about engagement distances and the behavior of torpedo attacks. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What Tassafaronga did, more than any previous engagement, was force the institutional recognition that the Long Lance was not a localized problem or a matter of individual engagements gone wrong. It was a systemic challenge, a weapon that demanded a systemic response. The response came in several forms, and none of them were quick or painless. The first was doctrinal. American destroyer commanders were given progressively greater latitude to use their own torpedoes aggressively and early, before the gun action opened, before the muzzle flashes lit their ships up for Japanese firing solutions, and before the Japanese destroyers had time to orient and fire their own spreads. The lesson of Tassafaronga, that the side which got its torpedoes in the water first had an enormous advantage, was absorbed and institutionalized. Destroyer commanders who had been trained to use their weapons as a secondary element of the gun action began to understand that the torpedo was a primary weapon in night surface combat, just as the Japanese had always believed. The second was technological. The development and deployment of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells in the later years of the war would eventually change the calculus of surface-to-air defense. More immediately relevant to the torpedo problem was the accelerating improvement of American radar, which gave U.S. forces increasingly precise information about Japanese positions and ranges, information that, properly used, could allow torpedoes to be fired at the right moment and at the right targets before any visual contact was made or any muzzle flash had given away a ship's position. The third was through a more aggressive application of air power to the surface war. American aircraft, first land-based from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, then increasingly from the expanding network of airfields as the island-hopping campaign moved northwest, began to find and sink Japanese destroyers before they could reach the point where their long land spreads could be decisive. The Tokyo Express was gradually throttled not through surface action alone, but through the cumulative weight of air attack that made every run down the slot an increasingly hazardous undertaking. And the fourth, perhaps the most significant in the long run, was simply the application of American industrial capacity at a scale that no individual Japanese technical advantage could ultimately counter. The United States was building ships. It was building them in numbers that the pre-war Japanese planners had known, and their private calculations were beyond Japan's capacity to match. The Long Lance had been conceived precisely as an answer to this numerical problem, as a way to attract American forces before the decisive engagement, to equalize the odds through superior technology and training applied in the night actions that American industry could not directly counteract. The weapon worked. It performed as designed. It did exactly what Kishimoto had promised it would do, from the night attacks off Guadalcanal to the Battle of Tassafaronga, to the savage close-range actions of the later Solomon's campaign. Japanese destroyer crews handled it with a professionalism that earned the genuine respect of their American opponents. But the Long Lance had been designed to solve an equation that had a time limit built into it. The attrition strategy worked if the attrition was sufficient and swift enough to alter the balance before American industry and American manpower could replace what was lost. Through 1942 and into 1943, the equation was still in play. The outcome was not certain. Men died in great numbers on both sides in the dark water between the islands, and the question of who would control those waters, and thus who would be able to supply their forces on Guadalcanal, was genuinely open. But the United States built ships faster than Japan could sink them. It built carriers and cruisers and destroyers in a continuous industrial flood that the Long Lance, for all its brilliance, could not staunch. By the time the Guadalcanal campaign was formally concluded in February of 1943, with the Japanese garrison evacuated in a skillfully executed operation that at least denied the Americans the destruction of the garrison itself, the strategic situation had shifted beyond what torpedo technology could reverse. The Long Lance did not fade quietly from a war. It appeared at every major surface engagement of the Pacific Campaign, where Japanese destroyers and cruisers found themselves within firing range of American ships. At Empress Augusta Bay in November of 1943, where Rear Admiral Sentaro Mori's force was turned back by American cruiser-destroyer force under Aaron Merrill, the Long Lance was present and drew blood even in a losing engagement. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the enormous multi-part engagement that effectively ended Japanese surface fleet power in the Pacific, Japanese destroyers firing Type 93 torpedoes were still capable of inflicting damage in the desperate close-range fighting around Samar. But the context had changed around the weapon. American radar was better. American doctrine had been revised, and revised again through hard experience. American fighter and torpedo bomber coverage made daylight surface operations by Japanese forces increasingly suicidal. And the fundamental arithmetic of the war, the accumulation of American industrial output against Japan's inability to replace what it lost, had moved decisively against the side that had built the most technically advanced naval torpedo in the world. There is something quietly tragic in this, if you allow yourself to sit with it for a moment. Kishimoto Kaneji's creation was a genuine masterwork of engineering, an achievement that no other naval power produced during the entire course of the Second World War. The British, the Americans, the Germans, with their considerable technical sophistication in submarine warfare, none of them fielded a surface-launched torpedo that combined the Long Lance's range, speed, and near-wakeless running until well after the war's end, when the technology became part of the general inheritance of naval engineering. The weapon outclassed every equivalent in the world. It gave Japan a real and substantial advantage in night surface combat for the first 2 years of the Pacific War. It killed American sailors by the thousands and sent Allied warships to bottom at a rate that, in the dark autumn of 1942, seemed to some planners on both sides to suggest that the campaign in the Solomons might actually end in Japanese victory. And it was not enough. There is a particular question that the Long Lance story poses, and it is worth sitting with because it is not a question with a comfortable answer. The question is simply this: what does it mean when the better technology loses? The usual story of military technological advantage runs in one direction. The side with the superior weapon wins, or at least wins the battles where that weapon is decisive. The Long Lance complicates this story significantly. The Japanese torpedo was better, measurably, demonstrably, dramatically better. than its American counterpart throughout the period when it was the dominant weapon of Pacific night surface combat. And yet the side that possessed it lost the campaign, lost the war. Part of the answer lies in the nature of the advantage. The long lance was a decisive weapon in close-range night surface engagements, a specific tactical context that the war increasingly moved away from as American air power denied Japanese surface forces the ability to operate by day and as American radar gradually closed the gap in night fighting capability. A weapon that is decisive in one tactical context and less relevant in others is ultimately bounded in what it can achieve at the strategic level. Part of the answer lies in the industrial arithmetic that no individual weapon could change. Japan's capacity to build, man, and fuel warships was finite in a way that American capacity was not. The long lance could kill American cruisers. It could not prevent American shipyards from building new ones faster than they were being sunk. And part of the answer lies in something harder to quantify, the capacity for adaptation. The United States Navy in 1942 was, in certain respects, not yet the force it would become. It was learning, at devastating cost, lessons it should have worked harder to learn earlier, but it was learning them. The doctrinal revisions after Savo Island, after Tasfaranga, after each successive engagement where the long lance made its presence felt, were genuine and consequential. American destroyer commanders of 1944 fought very differently from American destroyer commanders of 1942, and the difference was not merely a matter of experience. It was a matter of institutional recalibration that took to measure what the enemy had done and built responses into doctrine, training, and equipment. Japan adapted too, but the direction of the broader war gave Japanese naval forces progressively less room to maneuver and progressively fewer resources to work with. By the final year of the war, the long lance was still being fired by Japanese destroyers. But those destroyers were being sunk in the course of firing it, and no weight of individual technical excellence could change the outcome of battles where the material disparity had grown too vast a bridge. Kishimoto Kaneji survived the war. He lived until 1976, long enough to see the weapon he had invented become the subject of the historical reassessment it deserved, long enough to see the records declassified and the technical analyses published and the verdict delivered by naval historians on both sides of the Pacific that the Type 93 torpedo was, within its category and its era, simply the finest thing of its kind that the Second World War produced. He had been told it was impossible. He had been told the risks were too great, the benefits too speculative, the whole enterprise a distraction from more practical work. He had kept going anyway, through the failed tests and the explosions and the institutional skepticism, because he had done the engineering, and he believed the engineering. He was right, and the world found out he was right in the worst possible way, through the burning of ships and the deaths of sailors and the slow, painful revision of naval doctrine by men who learned from defeat what they had failed to learn from study. The I-19 and her captain, Takaichi Kanashi, did not share Kishimoto's longevity. Kanashi was reassigned after his remarkable September 15th attack, a hero of the Japanese Navy, rewarded with command of a larger submarine. The I-19 continued her operations in the Pacific. She was sunk by the American destroyer USS Radford on November 25, 1943, in the waters northeast of Tarawa, roughly 14 months after her greatest moment. There were no survivors. The Wasp, the carrier she had killed that September afternoon, was not replaced immediately. Her loss was one of a sequence of carrier losses in the Pacific that brought American naval aviation to a point of serious weakness in the autumn of 1942. For a period, the Enterprise was the only operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific. The North Carolina, struck by that extraordinary second torpedo from Kanashi Spread, was repaired and returned to service. She survived the war and stands today as a museum ship in Wilmington, North Carolina. The hole in her hull long since patched, but her story intact for anyone who wants to walk her decks and imagine that September afternoon when something that wasn't supposed to exist came out of the water and found her. The O'Brien has no such memorial. She broke apart and went down in the Pacific on October 19th, 1942, roughly 5 weeks after being struck. A ship killed not by a direct hit, but by the progressive structural damage that the torpedo had done. A reminder that the long lance's effects were not always immediate, but were sometimes slow and accumulating and ultimately just as final. There's a line drawn between what we expect and what we encounter, and the history of warfare is in large part a history of what happens when those two things diverge. The long lance diverged dramatically from American expectations, from the framework of assumptions about what was technically possible that had been built up carefully and reasonably from the available evidence. And that turned out to be wrong in exactly the ways that mattered most. The lesson is not that skepticism is always wrong. The skeptics who doubted Kishimoto had genuine reasons for their doubts. The history of oxygen-fueled systems at that point genuinely was checkered. The risks genuinely were significant. Reasonable men, applying reasonable judgment to available evidence, reached conclusions that were incorrect because the evidence they were applying was incomplete, and because of framework, they were reasoning within treated engineering limitations as more permanent than they were. The lesson is perhaps more uncomfortable than a simple narrative of always listen to the visionary would suggest. It is that the assumptions embedded in any analytical framework, the assumptions about what is possible, what is practical, what the enemy can and cannot achieve, carry a weight that is easy to underestimate precisely because they feel like facts rather than assumptions. The compressed air torpedo's limitations felt like facts about torpedoes. They were facts about a specific type of torpedo. The distinction is small in peacetime. In the dark water off Guadalcanal at 2 a.m. with Japanese destroyers firing from distances that weren't supposed to be possible, the distinction was everything. September 15, 1942. The USS Wasp ablaze and listing. The North Carolina taking water through a 32-foot hole. The O'Brien making for port with damage that would eventually kill her. The I-19 already diving, already slipping away through the blue-black depths, her torpedo spent, her mission complete beyond any reasonable expectation. 1 salvo, 3 ships, a weapon that didn't exist. Until the afternoon it did. The men who laughed are remembered, if they are remembered at all, through the ships that burned. The man who refused to accept that the impossible was impossible is remembered through the weapon that outlasted every expectation of those who doubted it, refined, deployed, devastating, and real. The long lance was never a toy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.